to have Claudia Emerson with us today to read for us and to discuss a little bit about her writing process. Claudia was born and raised in Chatham, Virginia, and she studied at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. Her poetry is steeped in the Southern narrative tradition and bears the influences of Ellen Bryant Voigt, Betty Adcock, and William Faulkner. But the collection Late Wife, which Claudia won the Pulitzer Prize for in 2005, the poet Deborah Pope observed, like the estranged lover in one of her poems who pitches horseshoes in the dark with preternatural precision, so Emerson sends her words into a different kind of darkness, with steely exactness, their arc of perception over and over striking true. Claudia has several volumes of poetry that include Pharaoh, Pharaoh, Pinion and Elegy, Late Wife, and more recently, Figure Studies. And Claudia, some of you have a new book that's just completed, coming out, I guess, later this year or next year. Her honors include 2 additional Pulitzer Prize nominations, as well as fellowships from the Library of Congress, the Virginia Commission for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts. And in 2008, she was appointed Poet Laureate of Virginia for a 2-year period. Claudia holds the Arrington Distinguished Chair of Poetry and teaches at the University of Mary Washington, Fredericksburg. Please join me in welcoming Claudia Emerson.
Can everyone hear me okay? Thanks so much, Adam Childs, for thinking to invite me to your lovely campus. I'm very happy to be here and also to help you celebrate this incredible new issue of your fine magazine. I think it's true for all of us aspiring writers, but poets in particular must have the small magazines. The big magazines are good, but the small ones are where a lot of us find our early homes and lasting homes in publishing and editing. I shouldn't tell this story, but I told Adam I would share some things about my writing life. And when I first began writing poetry, I wasn't all that young. I was never a very young poet. I was a younger poet at this point. But I didn't know much about the literary magazines. And so I started writing. I was working as a rural letter carrier part-time, and I ran a used bookstore. And not that many people came in. And around that time, I was writing furiously and decided a good thing to do would be to send a poem to Vegetarian Times. That's how naive, and I'm allowing this to be broadcast, I think, on the internet. So the people at Vegetarian Times wrote me, it was an appropriate poem, but they said, we like your poem, but we don't publish poetry. And I didn't understand that this wouldn't be as legitimate as anything else. But I got serious around that time about, to learn about the magazines. And now I work as an advising, contributing editor for the magazine Shenandoah, and I'm always a big fan of the kind of thing that Adam's doing with your magazine here. So congratulations, all of you. I thought I'd read some poems from Late Life and Figure Studies, and then some brand new work as well, and talk about the process that went into the creation of these books for you. And then I'm very happy to answer questions if time allows. I'll start with some from Late Life, which is my 3rd book. And I began writing this one after coming to the University of Mary Washington. Again, at that point, I was already in my 40s. Had gone through a divorce and landed in Fredericksburg, very happy to have my tenure-track job. And I met my husband, Kent, who's with me here today. And he was also single, but for a much sadder reason. His first wife had died from lung cancer, and he'd been very happily married. So when we got together, it's just the sort of the creative impulse sometimes that we don't want. I'm wired to write poems about things. And I've said many times, if you never understood the idea of mixed emotion, lived through what those months and years were like for me, being so joyously in love with somebody and yet also sad about it, that the only reason I'm getting to do this is because someone had passed away. So this section in the book is called Letters to Ken. They're in my voice, and the you in the poems belongs to Ken. And they're in loose sonnet forms. Artifact. For 3 years you lived in your house just as it was before she died. Your wedding portrait on the mantle, her clothes hanging in the closet, her hair still in the brush. You have told me you gave it all away then, sold the house, keeping only the confirmation cross she wore, her name in cursive chased on the gold underside, your ring in the same box, those photographs you still avoid, and the quilt you spread on your borrowed bed, small things. Months after we met, you told me she had made it, after we had slept already beneath its loft and thinning, raveled pattern, as though beneath her shadow, moving with us, that dark, that soft. This one needs a little bit of setup. I haven't read it in a while, but since we're all teachers here or involved in teaching, I thought you might appreciate it. Kent's wife, Lynn, was also a teacher. She was a special education, deaf education teacher. And I think we were moving into our house together when in one of these boxes I found her calendar book, her day book. And the thing that stunned me just flipping through it was in realizing that even after she had gotten cancer, she wrote chemo on the days when she had to have treatment, but she never did erase anything that she might get to do in terms of her work. And it was a real lesson for me in a certain kind of optimism, and also made me ashamed for every time I complained about having to teach my classes. This one is called Daybook. This is the season of her dying, and you have kept it, I find, underneath the stairs in a box filled with photographs. Her daybook of that last year, the calendar, a narrative she did not intend to write. In the grid of days, I see her habit had been to record in pencil what might be erased, moved, saving the indelible black for what could not change. Your birthday, hers, your anniversary. And in the same decisive hand, the disease began to eclipse this order, but she erased nothing. Now from beneath the days the hospital claimed, her first latent words emerge, faint but certain as images of ribs cradling milky lungs, the flesh forgotten as water you can see through to the bottom. The cough. You can't recall when it first appeared in her, but it must have been in late summer, around the time the locusts came and muted crickets, birds song, the wind. And in the same way you would not have perceived a tightening in the trees before the onslaught of that sound, you noticed nothing before it. Fatigue, perhaps, intolerance for the heat. She kept saying then that it would pass with the season, insisted, even as it consumed her, grew bolder, not sleeping even when she slept. It would outlive the locusts, but by days few enough to count. The translucent forms still left clinging to the world they had overset, each one a perfect mold of the body that refused it. I was saying to Adam earlier that I tend to conceive of books either in partial sequences or often a whole book. But regardless of that shifting of subjects from book to book, I have ongoing either fascinations or obsessions within them, and one of them is photography. And this poem is called The X-Rays, and it's about the X-rays of her body. But I also did a good bit of research into the quote-unquote invention or the discovery of the X-ray, which is, of course, a kind of photography. And the term shadow photograph, that just so you don't think I'm brilliant, made that up, that it was actually in my 1930s. Webster is one of the definitions of X-ray. The X-rays. By the time they saw what they were looking at, it was already risen into the bones of her chest. They could show you then the lungs were white with it. They said it was like salt in water, that hard to see as separate, and would be that hard to remove, like moonlight dissolved in fog in the dense web of vessels. You say now you kept them longer than you should have, those shadow photographs of the closed room of her body, while you wandered around inside yourself as though inside another room she had abandoned to her absence, to barren light and air, the one indistinguishable from the other. These poems, and the first part of the book takes the form of letters to my ex-husband, and then the middle part is a little bit messier than this section I'm reading from is the end of the book. The process of the writing of all of them happened over 3 falls and 1 spring. And I haven't been able to work in quite this way again, but my students were complaining that I assigned too many poems to them. So I said, well, I'll keep pace with you, and I'm going to write the same number I assigned to you. So it's a good way to write a book. I kept it up. But I wrote them, we were, again, Kent and I were newlyweds, first year, second year, third year, and you can see, and they're pretty much in a linear way in the book, and they begin to become much less emotionally intense as the time went on, and they rely very much on the context of the sequence for them to have any meaning at all. This is the last one I'll read from Late Life. It's called Stringed Instrument Collection, and again, I'm not quite sure what you would make of this one if you didn't know the ones that had come before it, but I don't mind seeing a sequence as its own thing with its own kind of integrity. But Kent is an acoustic instrument collector and a wonderful musician, and one time I said to him, boy, you own a lot of instruments, and he said, well, nobody actually owns instruments, they're just guests, they're visitors, and other people will have them later, which I thought was pretty brilliant. Stringed Instrument Collection. You began at the 3rd fall you were alone, and soon they surrounded you. Mandolins, mandolas, guitars, cutaways, dreadnoughts, the upright bass. You spent most of those nights with the jazz guitar, learning Birdland and Twilight Time. The others hung from inlaid necks, scrolled heads, patient, mute, the way they hang now from these walls. You claim no wood is ever dead, even if it's gone to fire and risen as heat, and think of them not as possessions, but as guests who will survive you, pass to other hands the way they passed to yours. Sometimes a name called out, a cough, a laugh will echo here, our voices in the hollows of their bodies, for now sustained. When I finished Late Life, I was frankly exhausted by it. I had never written anything so overtly personal, so close to my own autobiography. My first 2 books were not like that. I see myself hidden in them now, but at the time I didn't see it that way. So I decided, and I always have to remind my students that yes, we're poets, but we can make decisions. I decided to disallow the first person singular. I was just not going to use first person at all for an entire book. Just not do that. I'm done with that for now. And so I decided to look back on an experience I had before Mary Washington, when I gave up on the idea of ever securing a tenure-track position. I'd been teaching for many years at Danville Community College, driving between Danville and Lynchburg to teach at Randolph-Macon, what was then the Women's College. I was just worn out by it and landed a job as the academic dean of a girls' boarding school in my hometown. A disastrous pairing, if you think about it. Someone with a Master of Fine Arts in Poetry who's now overseeing the healthcare center, the writing arena. What else? I hired and fired faculty. I observed science teachers. Then when I left that position to go to Mary Washington, they asked me to serve on the board of trustees for the school. So I did that for 6 years. And pretty much the entire time when I felt at my worst or just thought I'm not going to survive this, you're a poet, you're never bored. So I go to these meetings and take notes. I look like I'm interested in what they're doing, and actually I'm just hoarding up ideas. I thought I'd read some. I wrote a 25 lyric sequence, 25 poem lyric sequence called All Girls School. And it opens with a poem called Physical Plan, because I was fascinated to learn that here at Northern Virginia Community College, what we're sitting in, your board will sit around and talk about the health of your physical plan. And I thought that was great. And if you give a poet a physical plan and stuff it with adolescent girls, if you can't work with that, you need to give back your MFA. So this one opens the sequence. Again, the girls' boarding school is an Episcopal boarding school in my hometown, so I went there as a day girl. I had an apartment on campus the years I was dean, so I was very much immersed in it. The physical plan. Everything here measures weight, effort, sin, and everything costs in this seclusion of daughters, the place and arc, its hold all of a kind in archaic combed order, straightened teeth, trained spines, the chapel's benches in rigid rows before crimson kneeling pillows, slim beds in dormitories, the muted ticking of practice rooms, horses' stalls just mucked, the halls humid with breathing, and in the brushes, their hair, enough to line the nests of 100 generations of birds. I base them around architectures, lessons, teachers. This one's sort of fun for me. It's fun to read out loud. It's called Latin Teacher. I blended together a Latin teacher at my school who was a very southern woman, lovely woman named Mary Virginia Gillum. And it's her hair I describe in the poem. And again, I forget which southern state she was from, but she would hand back a paper and say, "Why, Claudia, you got a D." And it was very sweet way. And I combined her with a very mean English teacher who did make us eat everything with a knife and fork. Latin teacher. Seamed stockings, sensible shoes, cardigan buttoned all the way to the top. She greets each of them by name as they enter her classroom, rebellious, identical. They want Italian, French, a younger teacher, anything but this woman fluent in a language that will not travel, the deep sound of her vowels, slow as the minute hand on the grinding clock behind her. Her hair is braided and coiled, contained in a bun substantial as a hornet's nest, ashen gray. But their mothers also were made to take it, translations all the more hated for being inherited. Then they are assigned to her table in the den of the dining room, where she directs them to eat even popsicles with a knife and fork. She serves fried chicken by inquiring if they prefer to walk or fly. And they learn to choose the leaner wing because they believe it pleases her. At Halloween in the darkened gymnasium beside the tub of water where girls bob for apples, she sits in a small booth to tell fortunes, peers into their palms, Esto, Perpetua, whispering again and again the same lie of a life so long they don't listen, their attentions lost instead in the swung shock of her hair, let down into luminescence, brushing the floor like a curtain just closing behind her. I'll read this one for our artist editor. I was explaining that one of my best friends at Mary Washington is the sculpture professor. And from her I learned about the subtractive method of sculpture and how the older professor would only let the girls at Mary Washington have I think it was a 12-inch block of salt. That's what they got at the beginning of every semester. There you go. And so I thought that was pretty fascinating, so I gave that as a lesson for the girls. Beginning sculpture, the subtractive method. They sit before the assignment, identical blocks of salt, and from tall, precarious stools look down into blank plains of possibility. In the end, though, the only choice is to carve something smaller. So they begin. Rough chunks like hail fall before the rasps and chisels, beveled edges. Salt permeates this air as it has for years. The floor gritty, their hands, eyes, even the skylights made opaque with it, disappearing not unlike the way it is subtracted from similar blocks in the fields before the tongues of the horses. That's not the whole of that book. It actually has two more sections in first person plural. Poems of women gossiping about other women. After they are nice girls in the boarding school, they sort of get mean for a little bit in there. And then also some told from the point of view of children. But I think what I'd rather do for the last bit is turn to newer work and talk to you a little bit about that process, and then I'd be happy to answer questions, because I do tend to work in sequence or book-length projects. And the sad thing was, after doing figure studies, which I was really proud of, for once, having some fun with the poetry and having a little bit of a sense of humor about it, which I hadn't really had because it wasn't personal and I wasn't writing so close to the bone. Some things just happened in my life that turned me back to the personal. And I didn't want that, but so I'm going to read some poems where I'm writing around it, so how I think of it, or off the subject deliberately. One of these is the death of my only sibling, my only brother, from cancer. He died in 2006. And the other that really figured into the book was the death of my father, not too long after, but who was almost 94. So that was the more expected or normal death, but they happened awfully close together. Here's one where, if I didn't tell you that, again, the book sequence will set it up for you when it comes out, but this particular poem opens the collection, and at the point of you wandering into the book, you wouldn't have any idea about those deaths. But it's called Late April House Fire Along Interstate 81. I had wondered for some time about its source, the smoke, a fixed roiling column visible for miles, unchanged by the wind that had all day blown across the road with pollen and bees of fine spring snow, salting fields, newly greening, the red buds livid beneath it. By the time I came upon it, fire was indivisible part of the two-story wood frame farmhouse, still itself completely whole, composed, white clapboard, porch and roof, front door, window frames, glass panes intact, the chimneys that would survive, calm inside the flames, straight brush, contained, bright rising ravishment. I knew this was nothing like the worst resolve of another hour, when the backward gravity of fire would have relented to the old habit of collapse, the sift of slow ash down on all that does not burn, hinges, latches, doorknobs, keys still sunk in the locks, the wind passing through windowless air. But this was anguish, not yet grief, and so I slowed, but did not stop to watch someone else's tragedy burn past this brief, nearly beautiful suspension that changes nothing. I suppose what I was thinking is, depending on the particular tragedy of that illness can be, the kind of cancer my brother had, he looked absolutely fine. And then you find out your house is on fire. This one is also writing off the subject of that. This is a really early poem with that in mind. When my brother's cancer was found, it had already metastasized, and he had tumors in his liver. You could see very clearly on all the images. And so we knew how bad it was going to be to make that go down. And so this one day, Friday evening in Fredericksburg, my brother lived in Missouri, so I wasn't looking at him very often. We talked on the phone a lot, but Kent and I saw one of the local radiologists having dinner, so the poem came from that. After hours, a glimpse of the radiologist. Behind the seamless window that is the cafe's outer wall, he faces his wife over a small candlelit table, a white-aproned waiter moving intent, unnoticed around them. The sidewalk and street lights frame their late supper, begun for him with a squat glass of Merlot, I'd guess by the stouter stem, the dark wine thick. The flute slender and tall, hers is more certainly champagne. The bead I can see streaming clearly from here, despite the light fall of mist forming on the glass between us. All day, he has been reading films and ultrasounds, x-rays, scans, looking inside our bodies, gray marbled breasts, sequenced by shadowy lungs and hearts, the rarer brain, a hand's delicate bones rendered into translucence. In this moment, though, he pauses to offer a toast. To her, I imagine, and to the most ordinary survival of a long week, or perhaps to the routine, nothing here of any interest. He has had the unusual pleasure to say all day, becoming beautiful and absolute, though nothing here at all. This is one, since a lot of you are writers and editors, I'll tell you what went on in the revision of this one. Again, I'm getting closer to writing about my brother's illness here. It's actually in the poem. But what got revised out of this poem is myself. This is one where I'm home with my mother and my father was still living. And I don't know if you guys know the tradition in the South, when your refrigerator was full, you would let a room in your house get cold around Christmas so you could put all the extra food in there. Anybody? I guess we don't need that anymore, but my mother still does that. And she's in her 80s, and so she had all this food up in my brother's room. He wasn't going to come home, and so she's a smart lady. Instead of going and getting the ham and bringing it down, she'd go up with the platter and the carving knife, which is a strange scene with my mom. And again, she would put on her coat and go up there. And so in the original version of the poem, and I'm going to give a talk on this, I think at Chattanooga, the Fellowship of Southern Writers, talking about revision. I had myself all in here, where I'm talking about my mother's going to cook and do all the stuff, and I follow her upstairs, and I don't know, out I came. So I'm no longer in this poem, but it's clear someone's doing the seeing, and it's me. Cold room. Her refrigerator full. My mother has stored some things in the cold of my brother's closed-off room. Christmas oranges and pears on the floor, the salt-cured ham that hung for a full year from the cellar rafters, cooked now and kept on the chest of drawers. He is far away and ill. She knows he will not come home, suspects she will not see or hold him again in the flesh, allowed him only in smiling photographs, undone by a voice thin on the phone. Afternoons, she climbs the slow, complaining stairs with a platter and carving knife. She wears her winter coat, opens the door to his bed, still made, stale white, the scent of ripe fruit and cold smoke. Here, in the room let go for this, she concentrates on carving the meat so even and thin she can see through it to the blade, its clean, practiced passage. Just so, she says, as though to no one, just so. I also, again, I told you my father died 2 years after my brother, but he was around for a long time. He had a rich life, so it's hard to think about him. That death is tragic. It's very sad, and I hated to see him become the way he became, and yet he was not an unhappy person in his dementia, so we were, I guess, blessed with that, and I tried to go with it. It's just a different place. You know, we always talk about understanding different points of view, and tried really hard to do that with him when I could. This poem, which is entitled The Present Tense, was a hard day for us because I was sitting with him and I asked him, he was just staring at me, so I said, what are you thinking about? Are you remembering something? And he said, I'm remembering Claudia, which was an odd moment. That seems all wrong, right? So I just tried to go with what he saw in there. The present tense. There will be a worse day. He will live long enough not to know me at all, and the turn toward it, begun this hour with recognition, has slowed to a measureless stare. Worse than the wordless pauses common now, he concentrates on me, direct and quiet, the way light concentrates, falling through a window to the floor. I hold his gaze until I am considering the surface of his eyes, the way I might the dulling surface of a pond, drought-shrunken, clouded over with dust and pollen. But there is light enough to see my face mirrored weakly, small, infant in the pupils as though from some great distance. Finally, I ask him what he is thinking about, or if he is remembering something he'd like to tell me. And at last he nods, saying, yes, he is remembering his daughter, naming me in the third person as though I am not the one asking, as though I am the one not dying, but already mourned, and he has survived me long enough to find solace in a memory. And I, as I have always known myself, am fallen away then from the present tense into reminiscence, the lucid was. I think maybe just one more, and then questions, and does that sound doable? I have, this one closes the book as it is. Oddly enough, I find this one very uplifting and optimistic, but you can see I can get pretty dark. But it's called Flocking Theory. I have an ongoing bird obsession too, along with photography, and I did a lot of research about why starlings flock the way they do and how those formations happen and how they keep track of themselves. And it's an interesting metaphor for what we're talking about in the magazine in terms of local versus global or the larger world, where in these flocks, the birds only know as much as about 5-6 birds around them ever. And that's what it takes to make the whole work. It's not an understanding of the whole, it's an understanding of the local, right? Okay, flocking theory. At dusk each winter evening, in the half hour before they must relinquish sky to night, starlings quicken, flock in forms, symmetries, shifting. The likeness is so fast and fluid, I can't hold on to anyone before it dissolves into another. And I've taught myself to accept the seamless recreations not as uneasy whimsy, but as the musings of a lucid soul, or the disclosures of God, the wind itself made seem, the shade a shadow casts. No one knows for certain what controls this, the flock moving by space, measured and kept strict distances between the bodies. But the birds, I like to think, are having none of theory anyway, whatever it may be, none of me, abandoning themselves instead to the invariable bliss of what is, the fact of flying manifest in every changing figure, one enormous wing, a waterfall of bees, a murmurous curtain falling to rise as smoke, a funnel cloud, helix, an arm, its empty sleeve. Thank you.
Questions? Claudia Emerson.
Jen? Right. The question is about how do you think about a sequence, and sometimes I'm just flat out wrong at the get-go of it, but I'll get an idea that I think one poem won't be sufficient. And usually I'll have a sense of how big the sequence can be depending on the form. Okay, the example of Lake Life, where there are 14 sonnets or sonnet variations addressed to Kent. I knew one poem wasn't going to do it. And the command in Hugo's The Triggering Town is when you have something huge, go small, small, small. So I tried to do that. And I also tried to be very restrained, so I chose a restrained form, and the connotations of sonnet or immortality of art and love and some things that seemed appropriate. But what happened in the beginnings, I won't say, gee, I'm going to write a 14-sonnet cycle about them. It doesn't quite happen that neatly, but I'll think there's a poem there about the quilt. I think there's one there about the day book, as these objects would appear. And so I start to jot the notes, and pretty much before I'd written the first one, I knew I had ideas for about a dozen. And I could have written 50. That's too much, right? You can't just overload people with your own emotional outpouring. So it's all about the restraint. So I take a lot of notes. I also use the wall or in my study. At that time, I think I was in a different office at school, and I would put the poems up on the wall so I can move them around and see what I'm doing with them. But I'll have an early, what I call table of conceits or table of contents, and I can see the shape of the book there. I knew there would be the divorce words, and I knew there would be the letters to Ken. I wasn't sure what was going to go in the middle for a good long while. But here's the pitfalls of sequence. You can write your ones that know they're going to stand alone all right. You could give just a little bit of setup and they're going to work all right. And then there are the ones, the sequence will start to boss you around. And it says, okay, I need such and so to finish me. And those can be a little bit more filler and far less standalone. I think Stringed Instrument Collection is far less standalone than some of the other ones in there. That would be up to a reader probably who hasn't heard me talk about it. But I don't mind those. I mean, my editor would say those are weaker poems, but again, if I see the sequence as its own organism, then those are essential just as much as the ones that read better out loud. So that's kind of my thinking of it. With the girls' school, I thought I could write hundreds of those once I got into it. So I limited myself to 25, which still seems like a lot. But they were couplets, they were lyric, there's no narrative there. So those were much easier to conceive as a sequence because it didn't need a narrative arc to it. And there are some interesting articles. I think there's Lynn Keller's Forms of Expansion, some other models I took. You were talking about Ellen Bryant Boyd. It seems so crazily different from Late White, but I adored her book, Kyrie. If there are any Great War fans out there or fans of the Great War poets, she wrote a fascinating sonnet mosaic, is what she calls it, of, again, sonnet ghosts about the pandemic of the Spanish influenza. And that one, I always sit at the feet of Ellen Bryant Boyd. By the way, she's from my hometown. Her mother was my 4th grade teacher. So Ellen was one of the first poets I knew anything about. That's prevention. Talk about local. But so I really modeled a lot of that thinking after that. And then it's me. I'm a little bit OCD, high functioning, but I like things to agree. So I want form to agree, point of view to agree, often tense to agree in the sequence. Not everybody does that. And Secure the Shadow was harder for me because it didn't come together quite so neatly. It felt very messy in stages and went through many more variations in its order than I'm comfortable with. So, some other things if you're interested to read about it, although sometimes I think it's better to save the theory for after you've already done it. I shouldn't say that to English teachers, right? It's a great question, given Jen's question, because I think once I got into, it wasn't a neat sequence, but a group of poems where it's clear that I'm talking about my brother's illness, and it's in the context of that hometown I'm from and some other things like that. I just thought the poems are me, they're through the lens of that, and I'm in some of them, but they're not about me. In some way I'm there. And so I think too, this will sound crazy, but in a way taking myself out of that poem, put myself in more than anyone will ever know in terms of when my mother says, just so, as though to no one. I am there. But when one of your children is sick, that's the one that you're thinking about. And so, I mean, your lives become these invisible sieves of what's going on in that. So I'm not sure that's exactly it, but I knew when I was revising it that I didn't have to be in the poem. And then in some ways it became artistically more interesting to have whoever is doing the describing is just a video camera kind of there, where it's filtering through, where you can't let yourself be in it, or you'll just collapse under it. So, if that makes sense. Yes, sir.
What was the reason for removing yourself psychologically? I know this isn't a new approach, but
I think actually it was an artistic decision in some ways, and yet when I look at it now, I see it as a psychological move on my part. That by removing myself, I'm actually far more there than I was before. I wish I'd brought the other version, because again, I'm doing this little talk on revision in Chattanooga, and I'm going to haul out the old one, which is much worse. I'm glad I made the revision. But to share with an audience, here's this version, and here's this one. And it doesn't sound like I wasn't there a lot. I'm just opening the door for her. And I talk about she insists on feeding my father and me the way she always has, even though nobody wants to eat, right? So just maybe 3 lines worth. So, but to take those out made it drastically different poem. Especially and the original version doesn't have the just so as though to no one. That's not even in there. It's just the last line of the poem is you can see through the meat to the blade. That's it. The poem ends. So there was something though, and this I can't explain. When I took myself out, she spoke as though to no one. Right? So I don't know. Is there a therapist in the room? Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure there's something there that I need help with. Yeah. Yeah, well, there's some interesting books about writing poetry, and you know this, you're an art therapist, but the act of writing is a way to survive trauma. One is by a DC writer named Judith Harris called Signifying Pain. Hers is a very interesting book, and then one is Greg Orr did a collection called Poetry as Survival. He accidentally killed his own brother when he was a child. And he writes in this book, he's written a lot of poetry about it, but he writes about what going to poetry, how that saved his life, basically. So he does a little anthology about poets that he sees as having survived trauma through their work.
Claudia Emerson, thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much.